The private jet touched down smoothly on the runway, its sleek exterior gleaming under the afternoon sun. Charles Whittaker adjusted his designer sunglasses and stepped out onto the tarmac with the confidence of a man who had never known limits. At 38 years old, he was the epitome of success, self-made, wealthy beyond measure, and always in pursuit of the next thrill. Life, for Charles, was one grand adventure, and today marked the beginning of what he hoped would be another unforgettable chapter. London awaited him, a city steeped in history and tradition, offering endless opportunities to indulge in luxury. He had planned this trip meticulously, booking stays at five-star hotels, arranging exclusive tours, and even securing reservations at restaurants where celebrities dined. But Charles wasn't just here to relax. He craved excitement, something that would make this journey stand out from all the others. After all, being rich meant having the freedom to live boldly, and sometimes recklessly. As his chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce glided through the streets of London, Charles soaked in the sights. The towering buildings blended seamlessly with centuries-old architecture, creating a unique charm that captivated tourists from around the world. Street performers entertained crowds near Covent Garden, while red double-decker buses rumbled past iconic landmarks like Big Ben and the Tower Bridge. Everything felt vibrant, alive, and full of stories waiting to unfold. By late morning, Charles found himself standing outside Buckingham Palace, marveling at its grandeur. Tourists swarmed the area, snapping photos and chatting excitedly about the royal guards stationed nearby. These guards, dressed in their striking red tunics and bearskin hats, stood motionless as statues, embodying discipline and tradition. To most people, they were symbols of pride and heritage, but to Charles, they represented an opportunity. He watched them closely, intrigued by their unwavering focus. Not a single twitch, not a hint of discomfort despite the blazing heat. It was impressive, sure, but also amusing. Charles chuckled softly to himself. How could anyone stay so still for hours? What if someone tried to break their concentration? The thought sparked a mischievous idea in his mind, an idea that made him grin wider with each passing second. With nothing but time and money on his hands, Charles wandered into a nearby art supply store. His eyes scanned the shelves until they landed on a small can of bright red spray paint. Picking it up, he turned it over in his hands, imagining the chaos it might cause. Surely, no harm would come from a little prank, right? Just a splash of color, a laugh shared among strangers. Then he'd walk away unscathed. No one would take it seriously, or so he thought. Little did Charles know, this seemingly harmless impulse would set off a chain reaction that would alter his life forever. For now, though, he strolled back toward the palace, the can tucked discreetly in his pocket, feeling invincible and eager to see how far he could push the boundaries of fun. The guided tour of Buckingham Palace was meant to be the highlight of Charles Whittaker's day, a chance to soak in centuries of history, marvel at opulent interiors, and perhaps even catch a glimpse of royalty. But as the group shuffled through the grand halls, Charles found his attention drifting. The ornate chandeliers, priceless paintings, and velvet ropes did little to hold his interest. He had seen luxury before. In fact, he practically lived it every day. What was the point of admiring something when you could buy it yourself? His mind began to wander, and soon he found himself thinking about the royal guards again. Those stoic figures standing outside, unmoving under the weight of tradition, seemed almost otherworldly. Who were they behind those stern expressions? Did they ever get bored, frustrated, or did they genuinely enjoy being treated like human statues? Charles couldn't help but smirk at the absurdity of it all. To him, their rigid discipline felt more like a performance than a duty. As the tour guide droned on about some long-dead monarch, Charles excused himself from the group, claiming he needed fresh air. Stepping back outside, he scanned the courtyard until his eyes landed on one particular guard stationed near the gates. This man stood taller than the rest, his posture impeccable, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Something about him struck Charles as both impressive and amusing. It was as though the guard existed in a world entirely separate from everyone else, untouched by time or emotion. Charles leaned casually against a nearby railing, watching intently. Tourists milled around, snapping photos and giggling nervously whenever someone dared to wave or make a silly face at the guards. The rules were clear. No talking, no touching, no distractions. Yet Charles wondered what would happen if someone actually broke those rules. Would the guard react, or would he remain frozen, bound by protocol? A reckless idea bubbled up inside him. What if he could test the limits of that famous composure? Not seriously, of course, just enough to stir things up a bit. Maybe crack a joke, leave his mark, and walk away laughing. It wouldn't hurt anyone, right? Just a harmless prank to liven up an otherwise dull afternoon. Feeling emboldened, Charles wandered toward a nearby shop stocked with art supplies. Inside, he spotted exactly what he needed: a small can of bright red spray paint. It gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its label promising bold, vivid color. As he paid for it, the cashier gave him a curious look, but Charles simply shrugged it off with a casual smile. "Just having a little fun," he said lightly, though the words felt hollow even to him. Back outside, Charles hesitated for a moment, weighing the consequences. Was this really such a big deal? People pulled pranks all the time. It wasn't like he was committing a crime. Besides, he reasoned, these guards were used to odd behavior from tourists. They'd probably forget about it 5 minutes after it happened. With that thought, he slipped the can into his pocket and approached the guard, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. Unbeknownst to Charles, dozens of cameras were already trained on the scene. Tourists filming videos, parents capturing memories, security personnel monitoring the area, all unaware that they were about to witness something extraordinary. And Charles, caught up in his own ego and thirst for entertainment, failed to notice the growing crowd or the tension in the air. All he saw was an opportunity to inject a spark of chaos into the monotony of tradition. Little did he know, this fleeting impulse would ignite a firestorm that would consume everything he held dear. Charles Whittaker stood just a few feet away from the Royal Guard, his pulse quickening with every passing second. The can of red spray paint felt heavy in his hand, its cool metal surface reminding him of the absurdity of what he was about to do. He glanced around casually, ensuring no one was paying too much attention to him. Tourists were busy snapping photos, chatting animatedly, and admiring the palace's grandeur. To them, Charles was just another visitor enjoying the sights, or so he thought. With a cocky grin spreading across his face, Charles stepped closer to the guard. His movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he wanted people to notice but not quite understand what was happening until it was too late. The guard, true to form, didn't flinch or acknowledge Charles's presence. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, unwavering even as Charles raised the can of paint. "This is going to be hilarious," Charles muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Without hesitation, he pressed the nozzle and sprayed a thick streak of bright red paint across the pristine white uniform. The vivid color splattered dramatically against the fabric, stark and shocking against the backdrop of tradition and order. For a split second, Charles froze, marveling at the chaos he had created. Then, unable to contain himself, he burst into laughter, a loud, obnoxious cackle that echoed through the courtyard. But the reaction he expected never came. Instead of joining in on the joke or gasping in mock surprise, the crowd fell silent. Dozens of eyes turned toward Charles, their expressions ranging from disbelief to outright anger. Parents shielded their children's view, while others quickly whipped out their phones to capture the scene unfolding before them. Some tourists began shouting, their voices rising in outrage. "What are you doing?" One woman yelled, her tone sharp with indignation. Another man shook his head in disgust, muttering something about disrespect and arrogance. The guard, meanwhile, remained eerily still, adhering to protocol despite the defacement of his uniform. It was as though nothing had happened, except now, everyone was watching, recording, and judging. Charles's laughter faltered, replaced by an uneasy smirk. He realized too late that this wasn't funny, not to anyone except him. The weight of what he'd done started to sink in, but there was no turning back. Within moments, palace security personnel sprang into action. Two officers approached Charles swiftly, their faces grim and authoritative. One of them barked orders for him to drop the can of paint, while the other radioed for backup. Charles complied immediately, his earlier bravado crumbling under the scrutiny of armed guards. As they escorted him away from the scene, he glanced back at the crowd, searching for any sign of sympathy or understanding. But all he saw were glares filled with contempt. As Charles disappeared behind the gates, the courtyard buzzed with furious whispers. Videos of the incident were already being uploaded online, tagged with phrases like disrespectful tourist and royal insult. Social media platforms lit up within minutes, amplifying the story far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. By the time Charles was seated in a holding room, his face plastered across news feeds worldwide, he finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. What had seemed like harmless fun just moments ago now felt like the beginning of something far darker and irreversible. By the time Charles Whittaker was seated in a cold, sterile holding room inside Buckingham Palace, his bravado had completely evaporated. The stark white walls and fluorescent lights seemed to mock him, amplifying the gravity of what he had done. His designer clothes, once symbols of wealth and status, now felt like a cruel irony, a reminder that no amount of money could shield him from the consequences of his actions. For the first time in years, Charles felt small, vulnerable, and utterly alone. Outside the palace, the incident exploded into a global sensation. Within hours, videos of Charles spraying paint on the royal guard dominated social media platforms. Hashtags like #disrespectfultourist and #royalguardshame trended worldwide, sparking heated debates about cultural insensitivity and privilege. Comment sections were flooded with outrage. Memes mocking Charles's behavior spread like wildfire, and news outlets scrambled to cover the story. Headlines branded him as the arrogant millionaire who defaced tradition, painting him as the poster child for unchecked entitlement. Back in America, the backlash hit hard and fast. Sponsors who had once clamored to associate with Charles began severing ties, citing reputational damage. Luxury brands dropped him as an ambassador, while business partners pulled out of lucrative deals he had spent months negotiating. Even his own employees started distancing themselves, whispering among themselves about how they never truly respected him anyway. Overnight, Charles went from being a celebrated self-made millionaire to a pariah whose name was synonymous with arrogance and poor judgment. Legal proceedings quickly followed. Authorities charged Charles with multiple offenses, including vandalism, trespassing, and contempt of national symbols. To make matters worse, representatives from the British monarchy publicly condemned his actions, labeling them as a direct insult to centuries of tradition and service. The court case drew widespread attention, turning Charles into both a spectacle and a cautionary tale. Reporters camped outside his hotel, shoving microphones in his face whenever he stepped outside. Strangers recognized him on the street, hurling insults or giving him disapproving stares. Every day brought fresh reminders of how far he had fallen. Charles tried to defend himself, issuing a public apology through his lawyer. It was a misguided attempt at humor. He said in a carefully worded statement, "I deeply regret my actions and offer my sincerest apologies to the royal family, the guards, and the people of the United Kingdom." But the words rang hollow. Critics dismissed his apology as insincere, accusing him of trying to save face rather than genuinely owning up to his mistake. Social media users mocked his explanation, calling it weak and self-serving. Even those who might have sympathized with him found it hard to look past the sheer audacity of his stunt. As days turned into weeks, Charles grew increasingly isolated. Friends stopped returning his calls, and acquaintances avoided him at social events. His phone buzzed less frequently, Not with opportunities, but with notifications about another article tearing him apart or another canceled partnership. He spent hours staring blankly at his laptop screen, watching video after video of his face plastered across news segments. Each clip served as a painful reminder of how recklessly he had acted and how irrevocably his life had changed because of it. What hurt most was the silence from his family. Growing up, Charles had always been the golden child, the one who made everyone proud with his ambition and success. Now, even they struggled to reconcile the man they loved with the person they saw splashed across headlines. His mother left tearful voicemails urging him to make things right, while his father barely spoke to him, too disappointed to find the words. Alone in his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Charles realized that his reckless moment of hubris had cost him more than just his reputation. It had fractured the very foundation of his relationships. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, the worst was still to come. The trial loomed ahead, promising further humiliation and financial ruin. Charles knew there was no escaping accountability, but deep down, he wondered if redemption was even possible after everything he had done. The courtroom was packed on the day of Charles Whittaker's trial, a somber space filled with reporters, curious onlookers, and stern-faced officials. Cameras clicked incessantly as Charles walked in, flanked by his high-profile legal team. Despite their polished suits and confident demeanor, even they seemed to carry an air of resignation. Charles himself looked nothing like the brash millionaire who had strode through Buckingham Palace just weeks earlier. His tailored jacket hung loosely on his frame, his face pale and drawn from sleepless nights. The weight of public scrutiny had taken its toll, leaving him visibly diminished. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They presented video evidence of the incident, replaying the moment Charles sprayed paint on the royal guard in slow motion for maximum impact. Witnesses recounted the scene vividly, describing how shocked and appalled they were by his behavior. One elderly tourist tearfully testified that she had traveled from Australia to see the changing of the guard, a cherished tradition, and instead witnessed an act of pure disrespect. Another witness, a British veteran, called Charles's actions a slap in the face to everyone who values duty and sacrifice. Charles's defense lawyers argued that it had been an impulsive, poorly thought-out prank rather than a malicious attack. They emphasized his apologies and attempts to make amends, presenting letters he had written to the royal family, and the affected guard expressing remorse. But the judge listened impassively, her expression unreadable behind thick-rimmed glasses. It was clear that excuses wouldn't be enough to sway her, or the court of public opinion. When it came time for Charles to speak, his voice trembled as he addressed the room. "I never intended to hurt anyone or dishonor anyone," he began, his words barely above a whisper. "What I did was reckless, foolish, and completely unacceptable. I understand now that my actions went far beyond a harmless joke. They were disrespectful not only to the guard but to the traditions and values that so many people hold dear." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "I can't change what happened, but I promise to spend the rest of my life making up for it." For a brief moment, there was silence in the courtroom. Some spectators exchanged skeptical glances, while others nodded slightly, perhaps seeing a flicker of sincerity in his apology. But when the judge delivered her verdict, there was no room for leniency. Charles was fined heavily, more money than most people would earn in a lifetime, and sentenced to perform 500 hours of community service. Additionally, he was banned from entering the United Kingdom permanently, ensuring that this humiliating chapter would follow him wherever he went. As the gavel struck, sealing his fate, Charles slumped into his seat, defeated. Outside, reporters swarmed him, shouting questions about whether he planned to appeal or if he felt justice had been served. He ignored them, climbing into a waiting car without uttering a word. The ride back to his hotel was silent except for the hum of the engine. Staring out the window at the gray London sky, Charles realized that this wasn't just the end of his trip. It was the beginning of a long, painful journey toward rebuilding his shattered life. Financially drained and emotionally exhausted, Charles returned to New York days later. Friends advised him to lay low, keep his head down, and wait for the storm to pass. But deep down, Charles knew it wouldn't be that simple. The internet never forgot, and neither did people. Every news article, every viral tweet, every snide comment served as a reminder that forgiveness might always remain out of reach. Still, as he unpacked his bags in his empty penthouse, Charles resolved to try, not for fame or fortune, but because he owed it to himself to become someone better. Redemption wouldn't come easily, but maybe, just maybe, it was still possible. Back in New York, Charles Whittaker's world felt like it had been stripped bare. The penthouse apartment that once buzzed with parties and laughter now echoed with silence. His phone, once a constant stream of calls and messages, remained eerily quiet except for the occasional spam email or notification about another scathing article mentioning his name. Friends who had once clung to him for his wealth and influence now avoided him like he carried a disease. Business partners cut ties without hesitation, leaving behind half-finished projects and mounting debts. Even his loyal assistant handed in her resignation, apologizing awkwardly as she packed up her desk. The isolation was suffocating, but what hurt most was the judgment from those closest to him. His mother refused to meet him face to face, instead sending long, tearful voicemails urging him to find himself and make things right. His father, a man of few words, simply said, "You've embarrassed us all," before hanging up. It wasn't anger that stung, it was disappointment. They had raised him to value hard work and integrity. Yet here he was, the poster child for arrogance and disrespect. Every family dinner invitation went unanswered. Every holiday gathering felt hollow without their presence. Professionally, Charles's empire crumbled around him. Investors pulled out, citing irreparable damage to his brand. Luxury brands canceled endorsements, fearing association with his tarnished reputation. Employees resigned en masse, some even posting farewell messages on social media criticizing his leadership and character. The business empire he had built over decades unraveled in mere months, leaving him nearly bankrupt. For the first time in his life, Charles found himself questioning not just his actions, but his entire identity. Who was he without the money, the success, the admiration? Desperate to salvage something, anything, Charles began volunteering at local charities, hoping to rebuild his image one small step at a time. At first, people were skeptical. Volunteers whispered behind his back, calling him that guy who ruined his own life or mocking his attempts at redemption. But Charles pressed on, determined to prove he wasn't the entitled millionaire everyone thought he was. He served meals at soup kitchens, helped clean up parks, and mentored troubled teens struggling to turn their lives around. Slowly, grudgingly, people started to see glimpses of sincerity beneath the polished exterior. One day, while mentoring a group of high school students, Charles met Emma, a compassionate woman in her early 30s who ran the program. She was sharp-witted, kind-hearted, and unimpressed by his past fame or infamy. When Charles introduced himself, she simply nodded and said, "I don't care who you used to be. What matters is what you do next." Her words struck a chord deep within him. For weeks, they worked side by side, organizing workshops and counseling kids. Over time, Emma became both a friend and a mirror, reflecting truths Charles had spent years avoiding. "You can't undo what you did," Emma told him one evening after a long day of volunteering. "But you can choose how you move forward. Apologies are easy. Real change takes effort." Her honesty forced Charles to confront uncomfortable questions. Was he helping others because he genuinely cared, or because he wanted to erase his guilt? Could he ever truly earn forgiveness when trust had been shattered so completely? Despite these doubts, Charles continued showing up, pouring his energy into making a difference. He started writing down his thoughts late at night, chronicling his journey from arrogance to accountability. These notes eventually became the foundation of a memoir, tentatively titled Painted Lessons. Writing it was painful, forcing him to relive every misstep, and face the consequences head-on. Yet there was also a strange sense of catharsis in putting pen to paper, admitting his flaws, and vowing to grow. Still, redemption wasn't guaranteed. Every public appearance drew criticism. Every attempted goodwill met resistance. Some dismissed his efforts as self-serving, while others argued that certain mistakes couldn't be forgiven. Charles knew they weren't wrong, but he also knew that giving up wasn't an option. If nothing else, he owed it to himself and to the people he had hurt to keep trying. Months turned into a year, and Charles Whittaker's memoir, Painted Lessons, From Arrogance to Accountability, finally hit bookstore shelves. The process of writing it had been grueling, like peeling back layers of himself he hadn't wanted to confront. But the finished product was raw, honest, and deeply personal. It wasn't just an apology. It was a confession, a reckoning, and a plea for understanding all rolled into one. In its pages, Charles detailed his rise to wealth, the reckless arrogance that defined his actions at Buckingham Palace, and the painful unraveling of his life in the aftermath. He wrote about the loneliness, the shame, and the slow, difficult journey toward self-awareness. The book received mixed reviews. Some critics praised its unflinching honesty, calling it a rare glimpse into privilege meeting accountability. Others dismissed it as a calculated attempt to rehabilitate his image, accusing him of exploiting his mistakes for profit. Readers were equally divided. Online forums buzzed with debates over whether Charles deserved forgiveness or if his story was simply another example of someone wealthy enough to buy their way out of consequences. One Amazon reviewer summed it up bluntly: "He's trying, but sorry doesn't fix everything." Despite the criticism, there were moments when Charles felt like he was making progress. During book signings, strangers approached him, not always kindly, but often thoughtfully. A retired teacher once told him, "I don't agree with what you did, but I respect that you're owning up to it." Another reader, a young man struggling with his own poor decisions, thanked Charles for sharing his story, saying it gave him hope that change was possible. These small interactions reminded Charles why he had written the book in the first place, not for redemption, but to spark conversations about humility, responsibility, and second chances. Emma played a crucial role during this time, encouraging Charles to stay grounded despite the mixed reception. She pushed him to focus less on public opinion and more on the impact he could have in quieter, more meaningful ways. Under her guidance, Charles expanded his volunteer work, partnering with organizations that helped marginalized youth find stability and purpose. He began speaking at schools and community centers, sharing his story not as a cautionary tale of fame lost, but as a lesson in learning from failure. His talks resonated with some audiences, particularly those who saw parallels between his struggles and their own. Still, the road to acceptance was far from smooth. Public appearances often came with backlash. Protesters occasionally showed up outside events, holding signs that read things like "Respect matters" or "Actions have consequences." Social media trolls continued to attack him relentlessly, dredging up old clips of the paint incident and mocking his attempts at reform. Even well-meaning supporters sometimes undermined his efforts by framing them as insufficient or insincere. No matter how hard he worked, it seemed there would always be people unwilling or unable to forgive him. But Charles learned to live with it. He realized that redemption wasn't something you earned overnight. It was a lifelong commitment to doing better. Emma reminded him often that true growth came not from seeking approval, but from staying true to your values, even when no one was watching. Slowly, Charles started letting go of the need for universal forgiveness. Instead, he focused on the people who mattered most, the ones whose lives he could touch directly, however imperfectly. One day, while mentoring a group of teenagers at a local community center, Charles met a boy named Marcus. The teenager reminded him of himself at that age, cocky, restless, and eager to prove himself. When Marcus asked why Charles bothered helping others after everything he'd done, Charles smiled faintly. "Because we all make mistakes," he said. "And if I can help even one person avoid the mess I made, then maybe my story isn't entirely wasted." It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy. But for the first time in years, Charles felt like he was moving forward, not to reclaim what he'd lost, but to build something new, something real. Years had passed since the fateful day at Buckingham Palace, and Charles Whittaker was no longer the man who had once craved attention for all the wrong reasons. The world hadn't forgotten what he'd done. How could it? Videos of the incident still surfaced occasionally on social media, accompanied by snarky captions or reminders of his infamous fall from grace. But Charles had come to accept that some mistakes followed you forever, like shadows you couldn't outrun. What mattered now wasn't erasing the past, but proving that people could change, even someone as flawed as him. By this point, Painted Lessons had found its niche. While it never became a bestseller, it resonated deeply with certain readers, those who saw themselves in Charles's story of hubris and redemption. Teachers assigned it in classrooms to spark discussions about accountability, while counselors recommended it to young people grappling with poor decisions. Charles received letters from readers around the world, many thanking him for being vulnerable enough to share his journey. One letter, written by a teenager named Lily, stood out. "Your book made me realize I'm not stuck being the person I was yesterday. Thank you for showing me that." Charles continued volunteering, pouring his energy into mentoring programs and community initiatives. He formed close bonds with the teens he worked with, especially Marcus, who had grown into a confident young man determined to break free from the cycle of trouble that had defined his childhood. When Marcus graduated high school and earned a scholarship to college, Charles attended the ceremony, tears streaming down his face as he watched the boy cross the stage. For the first time in years, Charles felt a sense of pride, not in himself, but in knowing he played a small part in helping someone else succeed. Emma remained a steadfast presence in his life, her unwavering belief in second chances inspiring him daily. Together, they launched a nonprofit organization aimed at teaching teenagers about empathy, responsibility, and resilience. It was hard work, often thankless, but Charles found fulfillment in it that money and fame had never provided. The joy of seeing a struggling teen find hope, or a skeptical parent soften their stance, was worth every ounce of effort. Of course, challenges lingered. Some people refused to let go of their anger toward Charles, viewing his efforts as too little, too late. Public speaking engagements sometimes ended in heated debates, with audience members accusing him of exploiting his past for attention. Yet Charles handled these moments with quiet dignity, acknowledging their pain without becoming defensive. Over time, he realized that forgiveness wasn't something he could demand. It had to be given freely, if at all. As he stood on a park bench one crisp autumn morning, watching children play and families laugh, Charles reflected on how far he'd come. His bank account was smaller, his name less recognized, but his heart felt fuller than it ever had before. He carried the weight of his mistakes with him every day, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the importance of humility and growth. Life wasn't perfect, but it was meaningful, and for Charles, that was enough. In the end, Charles Whittaker didn't become a hero or a symbol of redemption. He remained an ordinary man, flawed and human, doing his best to leave the world better than he found it. And though the paint stain on his reputation would never fully fade, he wore it as a badge of lessons learned, the kind that shaped not just his own life, but the lives of others willing to listen.